I want to welcome all of you and thank you so much for coming this evening. This is a celebration and a discussion of the publication of a new book by Professor Nadia Abu El-Haj called Combat Trauma, Imaginaries of War and Citizenship in Post-9/11 America, published by Verso. So Nadia will be in conversation with Anjali Kamat, and I'll introduce them in a moment. But first, I want to thank the BCRW staff, Sovi Kreetzberg, Postback Fellow, Avi Cummings, Director of Programming and Communications, Hope Dector, Creative Director, Miriam Neptune, Senior Associate Director, Pam Phillips, our Administrative Assistant, as well as our BCRW research assistants who are here this evening helping out, Sabrina Bone and Kelsey Kitsky. ASL is provided by Mark Barrios and David Kanyas, and photography is by Matt Harvey. I'd also like to thank IMATS and AV Services for their assistance this evening. So Nadia Abu El-Haj is Ann Whitney Olin Professor in the Department of Anthropology here at Barnard. She's also the director of the Society of Fellows, the Heyman Center for the Humanities, and director of graduate studies in ICLS. She is co-director of the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia. She's also the author of numerous journal articles and has published on topics ranging from the history of archaeology in Palestine to the question of race, genomics, and contemporary American, Jewish, and Israeli politics, and the post-9/11 wars and American militarism. With her projects, there is a concern with colonialism and empire, with disciplinary forms of knowledge, and with the ethics and politics of various epistemologies as they circulate and are inscribed in wider fields of practice. She has published three books, Facts on the Ground, Archaeological Practice, and Territorial Self-Fashioning in Israeli Society. That was out in 2001. And that won the Albert Hourani Annual Book Award from the Middle East Studies Association. She's also published The Genealogical Science, The Search for Jewish Origins, and The Politics of Epistemology. That was out in 2012. So this is her third book, and we're really happy to be able to celebrate with you today and to learn a little bit more about it. In conversation with Professor Abu El-Haj is Anjali Kamat, an award-winning investigative journalist, documentary filmmaker, and writer who has reported from around the world. She's been a senior reporter and producer at Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting, the New York Public Radio, and Al Jazeera's Fault Lines, as well as Democracy Now! And she is currently a fellow at Type Media Center. I also just want to point out that we do have a few copies of the book in the back, so if you'd like to purchase one, please do so. And just very thrilled to have both of you here this evening. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. They'll be speaking for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have a chance to open it up to a larger conversation with the audience.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me to do this. Nadia, I've actually been a fan of your work for a long time. I was at NYU, and I remember reading your first book and absolutely loving it. I did my master's looking at, Palestine and Israel, so it was a very formative book. So it's wonderful to be back in conversation with you. And reading this book, Combat Trauma, which I highly recommend you all get a copy of and read if you haven't. It's, I think, one of the most important books I've read that's really able to grapple with some of the key questions of what this endless series of wars that the United States has been engaged in since 9/11, the post-9/11 wars, the so-called war on terror, what that actually means and how to grapple with where and how Americans are thinking about the consequences of the wars to the people who are on the receiving end of the violence and why it's been so difficult to think about that. We know that these wars have destroyed hundreds of thousands of lives in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Pakistan, Syria, Libya, Somalia, the Philippines, and scores of other countries. I mean, US counterterrorism operations at last count were expanded to 85 countries around the globe. And when you look at just conservative estimates from Brown University's Costs of War project, they put the dead at nearly 1 million, and that includes armed forces from all sides, as well as contractors and civilians form the largest group among them. These are facts that are very much in the public domain, and they've been, as a journalist myself, I know they are in journalistic publications from time to time, usually during anniversaries. These are things that we know. Americans know this. And yet there's been no public reckoning with the consequences of what these wars have wrought and the scale of destruction that is really unimaginable. I don't know if some of you might have joined me, but I was in the crowds, many large crowds, on February 15th, 2003, opposing the war. Some of you might have been there as well, in New York City. That day was supposed to have the largest global anti-war protests in history. And then over the next couple of years, a small group of civilian activists from around the world organized a world tribunal on Iraq. And the idea was to do a civilian accounting of the crimes of the US war in Iraq. And I was at that time helping with the media. And since then, I think one of the questions that has really haunted me, and definitely many of us who oppose the war and have friends and family in countries directly affected by these wars, is what happened to that momentum against the war? How did anti-war voices become so marginalized and even maligned? Did people just stop caring about mass atrocities that were taking place in Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen? I mean, they were certainly still in the newspapers now and then. And one of the things that this book does is really give us an answer as to what happened. And the answer, which I want Nadia to talk about, is that the trauma and suffering of the American soldier came to take center stage in discussions about these wars. So even as the public was growing weary of these wars, the critiques were primarily about the costs of the wars to Americans: a bloated military budget, a waste of taxpayer dollars, occasionally what this meant for US moral standing in the world, and primarily the health and treatment of veterans. But nowhere in this picture were the victims of the wars on the receiving end of the violence at the center of the discussion. And so what happened is that rather than seeing American soldiers, as they might have been seen in previous eras, as agents of imperial violence, the perpetrators of violence came to be seen as victims of the wars, traumatized victims and selfless heroes all at once. So it's a very provocative and compelling argument that you make. And I'm wondering if you can just start us off by giving us a broad sketch of your argument. How did American soldiers come to displace Iraqis and Afghans and other peoples who were in the receiving end of this violence as the true victims of these wars?
So let me start by thanking, I need a microphone. I also haven't done stuff in person very much in so long. Hello, everybody. I want to thank Pramila and Miriam especially, and the whole staff of BCRW for having me, and Anjali for coming and generously engaging this book. I should say this is my first time trying to talk about the book as a whole, so we shall see. Let me start by saying a few words about how I sort of came to this project, and then how it developed over the years, and maybe by the end I'll also say a few words about what I think the various processes that intersected to get us here might be. But I actually first thought about writing something about the figure of the traumatized US soldier, and I use soldier in the colloquial sense. I'm not trying to distinguish between Marines and soldiers, et cetera. Really, in the early days of the siege, of the first, the first escalation of the war in Iraq, right? The first surge. Because it became very evident to me that, there was so much coverage in the US press about not just wounded US soldiers, but traumatized US soldiers. There was very little coverage, if at all, of civilian deaths at that moment. Some of that is structurally related, of course, to the way in which journalists were embedded and what people had access to. Some of it is not. It's ideological in terms of what we do and do not care about or talk about. But that figure so that was 2004, 2005. I was working on another book, but it was sort of in the background of my mind. And by the time sort of in the 2010s or 15-ish when I really began working on this, that figure had become so ubiquitous. The figure of the traumatized vet. Think movies, right? The Hurt Locker, American Sniper. I mean, the list goes on and on. Almost every, not maybe almost every, but the number of popular television shows that have a traumatized vet as a central figure. Grey's Anatomy, A Million Little Things, even very contemporary ones. That this figure keeps recurring. It's in popular media, so it's not only ubiquitous in newspaper accounts, but it's really ubiquitous in popular culture. It's also, you have this whole development of veterans literature, right? Post-war novels written by veterans that are winning big awards. Most of them have some kind of a traumatized figure in them. And this was not the Rambo figure of the 80s, right? These were sympathetic characters. So that was sort of that. So that's where I come from saying it is not just among psychiatrists and the amount of money that's gone into treating. It's not just among journalists, but in general, this figure has really come up. So having said that, let me just read a couple paragraphs from the book, because it might be the best way to summarize. And then if I haven't really answered your question, you can let me know. Okay. So let me start here. So I'm talking about the figure of the traumatized soldier and why and who I put at the center of my account, okay? He is perhaps the paramount figure through which the post-9/11 wars appear for and are engaged by the American public. This book provides an account of how this figure, in terms of who he has been, who he is now, and how he came to be, provides an account of this figure, and it explores the essential work he does in stifling political critique and in sustaining and suborning American militarism in the post-9/11 era in the process. Many scholars, journalists, and soldiers and ex-soldiers have argued not simply that the American public is disengaged, but also that the war on terror is absent from American consciousness. That is an accurate description only if one presumes that the soldier or the returned soldier has nothing to do with the war. The figure of the traumatized soldier and veteran is very present to the public. Perhaps one could say, from an American point of view, he is the war. I'm just going to read one more paragraph. By exploring the figure of the traumatized soldier in public culture, I aim to destabilize received truths about America's post-9/11 wars among liberals and conservatives alike. What if the truth is that the wars have been, in fact, ubiquitous in American consciousness, but appear through the figure of the soldier, rather than the actual conduct of the war on the ground and the subjects and forms of life that he has put in harm's way? What if the ceaseless demand for public recognition of and improved care for the traumatized soldier is not an unequivocal ethical good, as it might seem to be when measured against the supposed neglect and warehousing of veterans in the aftermath of the American war in Vietnam? What if this incessant demand that attention be paid, that we must do a better job of recognizing and caring for the troops, is among the incitements to American militarism, in helping attach the American public to the virtue of the soldier and thereby to the project of war? So that basically becomes the frame through which I then unpack the relationship between this traumatized figure and the wars.
Thank you, Nadia. I mean, one of the ways that you unpack this sort of changing figure of the traumatized soldier is by telling a really fascinating history of how psychiatric discourse on trauma and PTSD has changed. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about, how politics and critiques of the war were once a part of psychiatric discourse during the Vietnam War, and how they got erased over time. And if you can draw a contrast between how psychologists sort of defined PTSD, talked about the figure of the traumatized returning veteran in the 60s and 70s versus in the post-9/11 wars.
Right. So the book, to sort of make the argument I make, there are kind of two threads to the book. One does a kind of anthropological history of psychiatry, so I should say that, and the other is more what I read. To understand what was happening today, I went back to, so there's a general story that is told, which is that the origins of PTSD really are in the Vietnam War, and moreover, that it was the combination of feminist activists and Vietnam veterans that sort of brought PTSD to the fore in the 70s, and that it emerges as sort of a sign of victimhood. I can elaborate that later if you want. I go back and so this is one of the other things I noticed when I started watching the coverage of these soldiers coming back from Iraq and the surge in Iraq traumatized, is they were portrayed as victims. But I already knew that earlier literature. And what really, the center of the focus, and I'll talk about how it came about, of the trauma that American veterans of the war in Vietnam were suffering in the 70s, late 60s through the mid to late 70s, was that they were perpetrators. And that the trauma was the trauma of the perpetrator. So basically, historically, it was the Vietnam veterans against the war who worked together with several politically radical psychiatrists who were anti-war, figures like Robert J. Lifton and Chaim Shatan, although I think it's Shatton in English, and a few other people who had themselves fought in the war and then became psychiatrists, et cetera. And for them, the trauma of perpetration took center stage. They assumed that the war in Vietnam was an imperial war, that the entire war was a war crime, right? The war was a crime itself. And what they encountered, what the psychiatrists working in these veteran groups, and again, keep in mind, these were anti-veteran groups. It's out of that milieu that the initial theory of what is called post-Vietnam syndrome emerges. The veterans themselves are talking about guilt. They're talking about guilt for what they have done, or what they did not stop, right? But it's very much their own turn against the war, and they are grappling with their own participation in it that drives an understanding of post-Vietnam syndrome, right? So just to tell one story, there's a woman who's a psychologist working in the Boston VA, and she tells a story in one of her first articles. The story is, it was her first day on the job. Somebody comes in, a veteran, and tells the story, basically tells her that he thinks that his comrades in his brigade, whatever, were out to kill him because he witnessed a massacre of a village in Vietnam. And she tells the story about how she shares this with her fellow practitioners, as part of the, sharing patient files, and they all think he's a kind of delusional, paranoid character. And it turns out his fantasy was the massacre at My Lai, right? And so that, she becomes really involved in this. And then there's a whole theorization around the trauma of perpetration. So both for the people who were engaged in developing this theory of post-Vietnam syndrome, and in fact, for the federal government, Nixon, et cetera, talking about the traumatized soldier, talking about the trauma of the American soldier was seen as inherently a political critique of the war. They all had FBI files, not just the VVA, not just the Vietnam Veterans Against War as an organization, but the psychiatrists. They were spied on by the federal government. Flip to post 9/11, and I do not want to overly romanticize the U.S. military's commitment to treating soldier trauma, but they have put more money into it than they have in any previous war. They sent out mental health advisory teams within a year of the Iraq War and have been evaluating, collecting data. Because in this context, PTSD, however it's articulated, is considered one of the casualties of war. It's part of the business of war. There's nothing about this. There's nothing about recognizing the traumatizing effects on soldiers that is a critique of war in this conversation. And in fact, one of the starting points for a lot of these studies is killing is what soldiers do. That does not mean the U.S. is not a moral institution. I mean, the U.S. military is not a moral institution. In fact, it's all about how this is not the Vietnam-era American military. They're well-trained, they're trained in the laws of war, they're instilled to be moral, and then they end up on the battlefield, and not just do they have to kill, which is considered morally injurious for many people, but they also have to fight within terms of a counterinsurgency war where the enemy is barbaric. So it's a very different discourse. It's not a language of atrocity. It's a language of this is what war is, and how do we keep people from breaking down? And the thing that one has to keep in mind with this is this also has a lot to do with an all-volunteer force. You need to be able to you can't just keep drafting people in. So how do you keep the American military with enough personnel that are able to rotate back into the field? And one sees this also in the treatment protocols that keep getting shorter and shorter and shorter. I'm not now talking about the VA, but in the military itself, because this is part of keeping the machinery of the military working. So that is this very radical shift between the
That's what kept soldiers going on multiple tours of duty, right? And so there's, obviously tons of literature now about the kind of impact that that's had. But when you're talking about this, one of the things you talk about is the field of killology, which is a particularly disturbing section of your book. And I remember watching a documentary where the guy who supposedly founded it, where basically normalizing the practice of killing in war, but he also works with police departments, right? And there's a section somewhere in the book where you quote an author talking about, the kind of understanding and compassion that we are expected to give to soldiers and not see them as perpetrators and see them as victims, traumatized victims, is not what one is expected in the era of Black Lives Matter to give to American police departments when there are accusations of, what are they called, officer-involved shootings, right? And so what was this shift that allowed this to happen? And particularly the question of responsibility, right? With these new treatment protocols, where at a certain point, you talk about how post 9/11, some of these treatment protocols, as people were returning and had to be keep being sent back to the battlefield, there was a moment where they have to acknowledge what they might have done or witnessed or might not have done to save a person's life. But what kinds of responsibility were they being asked to take as part of their treatment? Because one of the things that I thought was so fascinating is it wasn't just that the psychiatrists were anti-war, but part of the healing involved critiquing the war, being a part of anti-war efforts.
So that's right. So, and I think I'm going to find the page where I read this thing. So to go back to the Vietnam War era, the commitment of the psychiatrists, people working at the Boston VA, these are people within the VA, right? And other VA offices, and the activists with the VVAW was, the war, if one is suffering combat trauma, and the war in Vietnam is a fundamentally political act, that there's no way to separate therapy from politics here, or healing from politics. So actually let me just read this one point here. So there was this guy, Jonathan Shea, who worked for the Boston VA for a very long time, and he becomes important in a revival of a concept he developed called moral injury, which I can talk about later if you want. But this is his description of the work they did in the Boston VA with, through the 90s, but it kind of reckons back to an earlier understanding of what the trauma was. What we do is political work in the richest sense of the word. Our patients all took part in the exercise of state military power in and around Vietnam between 1965 and 1972. And their injuries traced to this participation and to how power was used in military institutions. The dominating elements of power, makes the cause of injury political. The forms of injury are in part political, and as you have seen, how the treatment of injury we provide is political. We foster an empowered community among the veterans we work with. The task is to create trust. In a fundamental sense, our treatment is a form of democratic persuasion. We are in this together and are parts of each other's future as fellow citizens. So there was an incredible part of the healing process was getting people to go back out into the world, and particularly while the war was still going on, right? And take part in protests and go to winter soldier investigations and testify to what is done, because there was a sense of those being inseparable. Come post 9/11, of course, that's a very different reality. So the issue that shifts, and one of the things I talk about in the book, is it's in the 80s through the early 90s that one actually gets a shifting understanding of PTSD, where it gets consolidated as a condition of victimhood. The feminist influence actually is not in the 70s, it's in the 80s. But what's even odder, or what I didn't expect to find, is that if you really look at the conservative reconstruction of America and the Reagan policies, which included reconstructing the war in Vietnam, right, not as an actual loss on the battlefield, but Reagan also comes to power on this kind of white anti-civil rights reactionary force. And there's this movement called the Victims of Crime movement that starts in the 60s, picks up steam in the 70s, and then gets federally funded in massive ways in the 80s, which is basically a white movement of anxiety about quote-unquote street crime. And there's this convergence between their need for a definition of a victim, the recognition of victims of crime as a certain kind of citizen, and feminist activist needs to recognize victims of incest and rape as actually innocent. And although they come at this with different politics, in the end, what I show is there's a kind of convergence and entanglement that allows the transformation of PTSD into squarely a condition of victimhood. The reason that matters post 9/11 is then the treatment protocols that are really developed to treat people with PTSD tend to be, like someone like Edna Foa at Penn, these are short-term treatments for single incident traumas. They're designed primarily around the experience of rape. So what ends up happening in the post 9/11 wars, as military and VA psychiatrists and psychologists are encountering more and more soldiers who are traumatized by these wars, is their treatment protocols aren't working. And what they begin to articulate is, a lot of what they're suffering is not a fear of death or victimhood. They're trained, and as a lot of people say, they get a high. I mean, right, the certain kind of person's drawn to the military, they're trained in a certain way. What they see a lot more of is guilt and what they call traumatic grief. And so then they have to retorque and think about, so how do we recognize, in effect, the struggle becomes, how do we recognize perpetration without calling someone a perpetrator, right? So killing then, one isn't injured by a political event. So if you think David Grossman, who has this weird killology field, which yes, he now makes money off of, basically what he does with police departments is comes up with modules of how do you train people to kill without injuring themselves psychologically or morally, okay? Now, whether or not, I have faith that's pretty hard to do, which is maybe my last strand of faith in humanity, but whatever. But it's not a political, he basically makes an argument that we are evolutionarily wired against killing our own species. I don't know on what grounds he can possibly ground that. But in the psychiatric and psychological conversations, it actually becomes a kind of Judeo-Christian culture argument. Thou shalt not kill. That is the foundation of a kind of Judeo-Christian culture. Again, ignoring many, many, many wars fought in the name of Christianity, for one thing. And so what one confronts is the contradiction between that value, right, moral stance, and what the military requires you to do, right? So again, it's not about the politics of the war, it's about this is what war is. And in particular, this is what counterinsurgency war is, where you cannot tell the difference between the soldier and the civilian. And so there's not really a conversation about perpetration or responsibility, actually.
Right, because it's just elided, because I've seen this so often in, even when I've been trying to write stories about any particular incident in these past 20 years of wars. The question I'm always asked by editors is like, well, but what prompted US soldiers to respond in this way? There must have been, so when you look at the battles of Fallujah and the brutal siege of Fallujah in 2004, it's like, well, it was the brutal killing of those American contractors. That brutality and barbarism, that's what led to these acts. And this constant justification, really, of what codes of what moral codes or ethical standards or laws of war are American soldiers supposed to follow, even as supposedly an incredibly moral army, in the face of asymmetric warfare, in the face of,
Right. And,
which is a familiar argument from.
and do you remember, have you seen, I did, and I mean suffered literally, suffered through American Sniper? Like the opening scene. So the opening scene, for people who haven't seen it, and you know, this was a blockbuster film, right, is the American Sniper, the good-looking, whatever his name is, actor whose name I've repressed, I can't remember. Right, he's looking through the scope, and out comes a woman with a long abaya or chador and a child. And he keeps saying to himself, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, because what he knows she's going to do is hand the bomb to the child, right? And the whole opening scene is his pain over having to shoot the child. But it is her that makes that necessary, not him. So in fact, right, there's this whole, which Didier Fassin and Richard Rechman argue in their book, The Empire of Trauma, but here it very much focused on the soldier. What actually humanizes the American soldier, in contrast to those they fight, is that they suffer trauma. Trauma itself becomes the sign of their humanity because they feel guilty. They cannot just put this aside, and the assumption is that's not who you're speaking, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it reminds me so much of a lot of Israeli films about, you know, Israeli soldiers' atrocities in Lebanon, or in, you know, even Waltz with Bashir, which is a beautiful film, but it's all ends up being about the trauma of the Israeli soldier and their humanity, and a way of, yes, understanding they become human because they feel pain. And I think there's somewhere in the book where you talk about some of the psychologists sort of reassuring the soldiers, this is how you are human. I was curious, though, about in the post-9/11 therapeutic protocols, there was something I think called adaptive disclosure. And somewhere in there, they tell soldiers to make symbolic amends, like, right? Sort of do something symbolic, as in contrast to what, you know, people were told to do during the Vietnam War by some radical psychiatrists, was to, you know, go out and protest and talk about the atrocities, do things like Winter Soldier. What kind of amends are soldiers being asked to do in this era? Like, we're not talking about reparations, we're not talking about...
No, because it's totally individualized, right? It's individualized at the level of the soldier's suffering. So the side of adaptive disclosure, there's something that gets opened up. Adaptive disclosure is a protocol that is developed by a few people, one a psychiatrist in the Marines in combination with a bunch of people at the VA, but basically it's part of recognizing that the definition of PTSD is too narrow and the protocols cannot really take into account what this trauma is. And the side of it, so that's where they open up the conversation about what did you do, right? That there is a guilt about what one has done or failed to do, as in failed to protect, right? And it certainly moves, at least open it brings back into the conversation the question of guilt, right? And guilt is about conscience. Guilt isn't about chemistry of the brain. I mean, so there are ways in which this conversation opens something up, but it is individualized, so it is about symbolic repair.
And they're told they're just doing their job.
Well, but that's the issue. Right. Again, it remains within this question of a professional military, right? And that the military itself is not the military of Vietnam, which was corrupt, badly led, right? No control. So it just kind of reincorporates, right? There's no call, in fact, for any recognition of politics, but that does not mean that there aren't veterans from the wars who have themselves taken up what is this discourse of moral injury, which is the language of, I actually was a perpetrator, and this is from which I suffer, and taken that up outside of the medical world and used it, appropriated as a possibility of critique.
I mean, and you do have groups, right, like Iraq Veterans Against the War, or there was a Winter Soldier hearings in 2008 that, you know, they were sort of at I think a naval college, and then later they were also hearings in Congress. And I watched some of those this afternoon, and I remember watching them when they were live and sort of picking clips for Democracy Now, where I used to work at the time. And some of them are really compelling. I mean, you hear these veterans talking about just the atrocities they've committed and just being horrified by them, but also saying, this is an army that doesn't take care of us. How are we ever going to take care of Iraqis or Afghans? And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about, there is this widespread idea that, we don't have the draft. This is an army where a lot of people come from underserved communities, and a lot of people join the military because they don't have other economic choices. And then they might do terrible things, and then they come back, but they're treated horribly. And that's been the, I think, overarching discourse in journalism, certainly, and in political circles. How would you challenge that?
So let me first talking about the military and then talk about how I would challenge the framing. The military, we all volunteer for it. It's the professional military. It is not true statistically, although I was really surprised to learn this given everything I'd ever heard. It actually is not true statistically that it draws heavily from poor communities or minority communities. The vast majority of people in the US military are from what are called the middle three quartiles. They're neither very rich nor very poor. You have a lot of the kind of lower to lower middle class, barely upper middle class, right? It is racially, it pretty much heeds to the racial breakdown of the population, which means it is not, in general, it is not minorities are not overrepresented in the military, although clearly white Americans are overrepresented in the officer corps and in the special operations forces. So it is a kind of economic draft, but not the one imagines. It's the economic draft of a sinking middle class with fewer and fewer opportunities, and a largely white one. The military draws very heavily from the same base that does Trump republicanism, right? That's really the core of the military. The other thing I would say, and you can go, that's too strong a case. Not many people join the military only for economic reasons, right? I mean, again, think about it. Even joining the all-volunteer force, quote unquote, in the 90s was one thing. Post 9/11, you're going to war. It's a very different choice. People go in for complex reasons. They do buy the patriotism. People talk about going in, even the people who turned against the war, they wanted this fight. And then they went and realized, oh my God, what did I sign up for, right? Some people realize that. And the other statistic that's incredibly important is something like, I have the numbers written down, but I would have to pull them up. Something like, I think 3/4 of American bases are concentrated in 5 or 6 states. So there's incredible geographic separation. Below the Mason-Dixon line, California, a few other states. And 25% of people in the military have parents in the military or grandparents, and if you add siblings, cousins, et cetera, it's 75%. So what people are beginning to talk about is referring to as a separate caste as well. A lot of what encourages people to go into the military is having grown up on bases, around bases, with family members who have been in the military. So there are many dynamics and reasons for which people go into the US military. And a simple racial class analysis, which is focusing on minorities and poverty, is actually not the answer. For one thing, you need a high school degree to get into the military, right? So that's one answer. So I think it's important to know that it's a more complex story than the one that the left likes to tell. It is, which I think brings up the police, and then I'm going to go into the framing. I think it's worth keeping in mind, again, this sort of mantra of support the troops no matter what you think of the war. Now, again, whatever support the troops means, but in the context of what it means is a kind of deference and reverence for anybody who went to war, who are kind of trauma heroes, not really victims. They're both traumatized but heroic. But there's no parallel liberal or progressive discourse about the police. Nobody would say support the policemen, but not the shooting of black men in the streets. I don't know. And it draws from the same class background, And, right, the distribution of class and race is pretty similar. And I think that says a lot about the kind of nationalist limits of progressive American politics. Okay, so how would one respond to the framing? I think the issue is in, and this is something I do trace in the book, in very complex ways, and I do not mean to make an argument that this is some conspiracy and done at a level of consciousness. I mean, in that, you know, I wish there were 6 people in a room making a decision, then we could get rid of the 6 people and we'd move on. But the issue about this separation, so that's about 1% of the population over 18, about 0.5% of the population as a whole, is that what we have then is there's no longer a draft, which assumes, by the way, that the draft was far more equal than it really was during the war in Vietnam, which it was not. And second, so there's incredible separation. There is this constant talk, which you can't live in this country without hearing about the civil-military divide. Civilian has come to mean, in most talk about the war, when Americans talk about civilians, they mean American citizens who have no experience of war. The civil-military divide is about a divide between people who've been in the US military or are in the US military and Americans who, quote unquote, know nothing about war. And that becomes the problem. The terms, because what ends up happening is there's a kind of deference, not just to supporting the troops, as in there's a kind of thank you for your service, this kind of thing, but it ultimately, which I trace in the book in complex ways, shuts down the possibility of critique. There's a way in which we can't talk about the war because to criticize the war too much might be taken as criticizing troops, and we have to support the troops. So I show all these complicated ways in which there's a deference not just to, there's a deference to the soldier in terms of thank yous, let's say, which is received very cynically, but also in terms of who can actually narrate what happened in the war and who has the right to speak about the war. And it is not, in general, quote unquote, American civilians. So one can cover the problem of the military and what it means to have a democratic nation that goes to war with a professional army, let alone all the contractors. But the way in which it's tethered to the civil-military divide, which then effectively shuts down certain kinds of actually political conversations about the war, which is what were the wars badly fought? Were there abuses at Abu Ghraib? But was the war a war crime? I mean, if you go into a war under false pretenses, under the laws of war, it is a war crime, right? Should the US have gone into Afghanistan is a very different question than, was it badly managed? Were there atrocities? Et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, I thought that was one of the most fascinating sections of the book where you talk about how, you know, the idea of framing the soldier as a victim hero, also as a traumatized victim hero, also gives them the sort of position of being a truth teller in some way, and that the truthfulness of their experience, and then their experience becomes the experience of the war, and the only one we're allowed to pay attention to, and the only one that's believable. You know, there's no space for any Iraqi or Afghan experience of the war, let alone what American civilians who might be asking critical questions of the war, where there's space for that kind of conversation. I mean, in fact, you have, you know, you talk about some journalists and people who work with returning veterans sort of telling people, listen without judgment to what the veterans are saying. And don't ask if you've killed anyone.
Right, listening without judgment, right. So there's a kind of therapeutic model that then becomes the model. So I don't know if anybody went to this, but there's this, Columbia staged, had a reading, there's this group called Theater of War that stages these ancient Greek plays. And it's imagined, I mean, Theater of War is a complicated organization, but they also stage these, they read these certain plays by Sophocles as if they were therapeutic projects to begin with. There's debates among classists about whether that makes any sense. But, I mean, the readings are very powerful, but it's staged in a mixture of a civilian veteran audience. And the question, and the point is that the performances, you get these performances that are kind of, these cathexis of pain, right? And then you get into these complicated discussions between vets in the audience and non-vets in the audience. And there was one staged at Columbia. And the whole thing did devolve into listening without judgment, right? And some of it was on the part of the organizer, but there was a lot of deference being demanded in the room. It's set up as a dialogue, but you cannot have a dialogue if you're not allowed to actually engage in the conversation, right? And that's effectively what is going on here.
I'm curious if, I mean, and this isn't a part of your book, but if in the course of researching your book you came across any debates around the trauma of people in Iraq and Afghanistan and other theaters of American war. And because that's something, you know, as a journalist, I've definitely come across a lot. And it's something, you know, when you sort of talk to people from, you know, who've lived through these wars, it comes across in very complex ways. And it's something I, you know, encountered even last year for the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I did a podcast for Reveal and, you know, talked to this Iraqi journalist who was talking about Fallujah in 2004, and, you know, just talking about his, like, realizing his own horror at realizing that this landscape of his childhood had been turned into a graveyard, and then finding out that his young cousins, 16-year-olds, were fighters against American soldiers during the siege of Fallujah, finding out his uncles were fighters, finding out how his cousin was brutally tortured at Abu Ghraib and then came out to join the Iraqi police and then was killed by Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was created, you know, after the invasion. And, you know, over time has sort of seen his family just break down, mentally break down, unable to deal with these wounds of war. And overwhelmingly, whether in Iraq or Afghanistan or places where there have been drone strikes like Pakistan and Yemen, there is overwhelmingly a lack of resources and, you know, just no support for how people deal with the ongoing trauma of war and the fear of death.
I mean, Anjali had sent me some questions to think about, and I have to say, reading that question was so striking to me how little I came across that. I mean, there's some contexts in which, I mean, there's sometimes some gestures towards it, so this book isn't about civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we recognize blah, 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 and then you move on. There is certainly this extraordinary discourse where, so some veteran writers who want to incorporate, let's say, some Iraqi writers into their circle, and it's almost as if they share a similar position of, they share a similar ethical position. They've both suffered the war. I mean, on both sides. They have a lot of that suffering is psychological or whatever, traumatic. But the equivalence that should be drawn is between U.S. combatants and combatants in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the equivalence is always the U.S. combatant and the Iraqi or Afghan civilian. So in those weird ways, it can seep in. But the striking absence, so let me tell two brief stories. I don't think either of them are in the book, but maybe one is. I was in one of the workshops that was training people who, I went to a bunch of workshops, training workshops on various iterations of soldier trauma. And one of them was a workshop run by a psychologist who worked in the VA somewhere in upstate New York, had been doing this for 20 years, 25 years. And he started, and it was on PTSD, so it's, you know, it's just sort of conversing with people that work in various contexts with veterans, you know, churches, NGOs, whatever, some actual psychologists. And he started by going around the room and asking people to offer examples of the kinds of experience that might lead to PTSD. And we got, you know, war, combat, kidnapping, prisoner of war, rape, incest, all the way around. So after, like, you know, I raised my hand, I said, being a civilian in a war zone, and he sort of sat back in his chair and said, you know, you're right, but we don't think about that very much. And I thought, well, yeah, that's interesting, right? And the other thing is, if you follow the DSM, which is the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, so the 1980 edition, which is the third edition, is the first time PTSD is mentioned as a diagnosis. The last one is DSM-5, and I'm pretty sure it was 2013 or 2014. Until 2013 or 14, if you look at who are possible, who are the kinds of subjects who might suffer PTSD as examples, they give combatants, prisoners of war, survivors of concentration camps, rape victims, incest, sometimes, survivors of natural disasters. It is not until the DSM-5 that it mentions civilians in war zones. That doesn't mean that psychiatrists have not been treating people, but it's an extraordinary commentary on American parochialism about war and the fact that American wars are never fought on American soil. So there's an incredibly distorted understanding of what war is, who it affects, who suffers it, right? Even if, of course, if you ask people, they'll say, oh, of course. But the question is what comes to mind and what doesn't, right?
That's really astounding.
Yeah, I kept looking because I couldn't
Yeah.
believe it, but
Yeah.
I'm not making this up.
You know, because it's in many of these places when you talk to people, I mean, the people are so obviously traumatized. And it's, you know, I remember at some point when I was at Al Jazeera, we were trying to make a film about, you know, because partly feeling like there's so much emphasis on the traumatized American soldier, let's try and make a film about the psychological impact of war on, you know, people who are affected by drone strikes in parts of Pakistan, or, you know, I think at that point it was difficult to get to Iraq. So there's a couple of examples, but it was so hard to even find, you know, experts who could talk about this.
Well, the infrastructures don't exist in the same way, right? I mean, there's massive NGO infrastructures, but they pulled out of Iraq and large parts of Afghanistan a long time ago, right?
Yeah.
And then, right, I mean, it's the institutional.
Yeah, it's just a huge gap. And I know we have to switch to questions to the audience very soon, but I have one last question, which is, you know, and we've sort of been talking about this, you know, how Americans have kind of evaded the question of responsibility and accountability, war crimes, and what we owe to people in places that have been destroyed in these wars. And at one point, I'm just going to quote a little bit from your book. You say that you write about how the trauma that soldiers suffer presupposed and often require mention of the people and communities who have been injured, killed, and had their lives and worlds destroyed by US military personnel. The facts are known, but they do not rise to the level of public concern. They do not seem to merit consideration and judgment. They are but meaningless particulars in most public discussions of American military violence unleashed on foreign soil. The public knows more than enough to render judgment on the wars, if only it decided it mattered. So can you say a little bit about what you think the responsibility is of Americans for these wars, and how, you know, in writing this book, how you're hoping to kind of make an intervention in terms of acknowledging the enormity of that responsibility?
Okay, so let me start by going back to the quote-unquote civil-military divide. And again, a lot of this discourse was much more prominent, I would say, 2010 to 2015 than now. But when there's talk of responsibility for the wars, it tends to be the responsibility of American civilians, in other words, citizens who are non-military, towards those who went off to war in our name, right? So part of what I'm trying to argue, what I argue in the book is, A, let's take that apart, but also to say, if American civilians, a term I will not use generally in the book, bear responsibility for this war, so do American soldiers, right? The difference with the Vietnam era isn't just the draft, it's that there were massive anti-war movements among soldiers and veterans. It wasn't just this, right? So even if there has been no political, or very little political mobilization on the part of American citizens against the war, that is as true of people in the military or ex-military as whatever. So whatever that responsibility is, you got to shift it and shift it off this, what is a really stereotypical figure of the American civilian. But let's just talk about basics, refugees, right? Ukraine war breaks out and all of a sudden the doors are open. It has been an incredible fight to get Iraqi and Afghan refugees, including people who work for the US military, into this country, right? The AUMF, right? The authorization to use military force, 2001. It is temporally and geographically unbound. It is still in force. The Congress finally passed a bill to rescind it last fall, never made it through the Senate. Then Russia invaded Ukraine. I sort of end the book sort of arguing in some way I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is going to allowing the U.S. to reconstruct itself as a moral leader in the world without ever having to reckon with 20 years or 22 years of disastrous wars that are not over. Burn pits, right? Now suddenly there's all this, finally, don't get me wrong, question about recognition that American veterans and soldiers are suffering these incredible cancers and diseases as a result of burn pits, and there's all this money going in. Well, if burn pits have ruined the health of American soldiers, what the heck is going on the ground, right? So one could think reparations in all sorts of ways, but you have to start by recognizing the destruction that is ongoing, both because the Americans have not even pulled out even of Afghanistan and Iraq. There are special soldiers, I know from someone here, still on the ground in Afghanistan, although we don't know it. We know they're in Iraq. We know they're in Syria, right? Those wars are still being fought. And the damaging effects of these wars are ongoing. And as an aside, I actually want to say that because there's such a large or growing conversation also about the increasingly light footprint of American warfare, and part of that is, quote unquote, precision killing. We kill less people than we used to. So Samuel Moyn has a relatively new book called Humane, right? And yes, I can go along with a lot of it. It's all about how lawyers have gotten involved, and so they're part of the deciding on striking, and you can't sort of strafe, you can't have free fire zones the way you had in Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. But what he accepts is the death count is who the American military actually shoots and kills or drops a bomb on. But what if one counted death another way, right? What if one thinks about the long-term consequences of environmental destruction, of dropping uranium-depleted weapons on Fallujah, right? Then the violence and the killing looks a lot more expansive than it is, and it does not end when American troops return, right? But we can't have any conversation about responsibility for that if we don't even talk about it, right?
And it's such a hard conversation to have, even while doing the podcast that I shared with you. I remember at some point, someone I played it to, another journalist was like, "Are you really blaming America's invasion for all the ills in Iraq? I mean, they had problems before the Americans invaded." And it's like, well, actually, ISIS would not have come about if it were not for the
certain
American
things
invasion.
for sure would not.
Yeah.
Al-Qaeda in Iraq wouldn't have come.
Exactly, and I think it's that's why I always talk about the costs of war projects estimates as like the most minimal estimate of like the numbers of the dead. Because when you start to count, environmental damage, health damages, I mean, there's so much.
Collapse of medical systems.
Right.
The lack of right, no, absolutely.
Yeah, it's,
the withholding of the Afghan money,
Exactly.
right? Since the Taliban took over. Well, what are the effects of that?
yeah, I mean, it's really unimaginable, and that's the scope. Thank you so much, Nadia.
Thank you.
This was wonderful. I'd like to open it up, so if anyone has any questions.
I participated as a young man in the rap groups that Mr. Lifton organized. So let me give you a little context about why that happened. Most Americans, the year or two before Lifton and others decided to do those rap groups, were completely in favor of pardoning Cali and Medina in the aftermath of the revelations of the massacre, several massacres in that area of Vietnam. People looking at the My Lai massacre, there actually were several massacres that day. Now, most Americans felt that they were justified and right, which brings me to a series of questions for you. Public opinion in the United States basically views what happened after 9/11 is they got what they deserve. I would say that that's a prevalent opinion among many Americans. And to generalize about those of us who were involved in Vietnam Veterans Against the War, we were a very small percentage of the veteran community at that time. Because even if you look at opinion polls that were taken, in fact, inspired by what occurred as a result of that rap group, you talk about, I think, Dr. Shea, they had big opinion polls that were mounted of Vietnam veterans compared to their contemporaries, and they showed that most Vietnam veterans were split about their attitudes towards whether the war was right or wrong. They all felt it was a mistake, 80% of them, but most of them felt, okay, it was right, and those divisions have still persisted to this day in many ways. So that's a wider question about the question of how the public perceives the right or wrong of these kind of interventions. Another aspect of this is after 9/11, I want to talk about popular culture. You introduced it with the American Sniper. You started with talking about the American Sniper. I go way back into that. I go back into the kind of things that happened in the time when I was a young man and how the war was being projected to the public coming back from the war. And, everybody gets into this whole question of, the crazy Vietnam vet coming back, you can't trust them, they're going to go nuts, et cetera. But the popular culture was mixed. There was part of it that glorified what we had done and didn't question what we had done, felt that those attacking us were wrong, immoral, et cetera. And look at the kind of debates we have as Americans today with this ridiculous kind of nonsense going on to have somebody like Trump to be president of the United States. Absolutely obscene. So those wider questions of popular culture, I'd like to hear you address. I have very strong feelings about what happened in terms of what evolved to the DSM-3, because I know all the people involved who led that charge to get the DSM-3 recognized, and you got into questions of money. VA did not want to get into a situation, look at what happens right now. If somebody's discharged in the Army or the Marine Corps or Combat Arm, they're immediately said, okay, make sure you document that you have this problem or that problem. And then you get people in the conservative line who say, oh, well, trauma is just a way for a GI to basically make money off the VA, And so I'm just curious, because I'm sure you encountered all this when you're looking at the work.
Yeah, so let me start with the money thing and then I'll go backwards. Yeah, so one of the things that's very clear, so the transition, there's a tension between where, the DSM goes over the from the 70s through the early 2000s, and what actually is still going on in VAs, where most of the treatment is still psychodynamic and long-term. And as these wars, post-9/11 wars, people start coming back, and all these higher and higher numbers of people who are clearly being diagnosed or potentially diagnosed with PTSD, you have the convergence, I think, of a field of psychiatry that has moved towards what's called evidence-based medicine and cognitive behavioral therapies, which are both a certain understanding of evidence, which psychodynamic theory doesn't have, but also they're short-term protocols. So the discipline is in that direction, but clearly they can't afford it. I mean, that's exactly what it is. Like, if you can get this down to a 10 or 12-week protocol, that's a lot cheaper than keeping people in therapy for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So there's a total financial piece of even the forms of treatment that the military and the VA recognize as what they consider efficacious. But that's inside, so absolutely. Yeah, look, I think part of the VVAW, right, was a small percentage of veterans, but it was a very organized, loud percentage, and it was a moment in time where there were so many other radical political movements, right? So what one got of divided nation at a certain point in the Vietnam War that wasn't just about the war in Vietnam, of course. It was, it was like the civil rights movement that, then gets linked up to the racism in Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to overstate the case and say, well, this is what most veterans thought. I think the issue is it's still a striking contrast between what happens post 9/11. I'll get to post 9/11 in a minute. And you're right, the question of people who were proud of their service, or at least were not willing to accept Lifton's argument that the whole war was a crime, everybody that went was participating in atrocities, et cetera. That's what allows the Reagan conservative reconstruction of the war in the 80s, where you recuperate the Vietnam veteran as hero rather than crazy vet, right? And that's part of a whole reconstruction of the war and the building of the Vietnam Vet Memorial, but also the kind of neoconservative reconstruction of the role of America in the world, wanting to reconstitute the military as having a mission that needs to continue in the world. So I do follow that, and you're right, there's a very complicated story there. Post 9/11, what was I going to say about that? Now I've completely forgotten. I don't remember. But one thing I will say is there's such this discourse that the post 9/11 wars, oh, I know where it's going, are haunted by Vietnam, right? And what happened to veterans. First of all, I think that language is a real problem because it makes it sound, it rides over the fact that this was a conservative political effort to reconstruct the war in Vietnam, the source of the problem, which was the war was lost on American soil because Vietnam veterans were treated so badly by American civilians, quote unquote, as if it's some natural outgrowth of how people should be treated. But what I wanted to say now that I remember about post 9/11 is, yeah, I think what has fascinated me much more writing this book is not the position of conservatives in America or Bush supporters. Like, we know that they were pro-war and pro-militarism. I mean, they're like, we can see this, right? It's that even in kind of liberal progressive circles, there's an extraordinary silence about the post 9/11 wars. With the rise of Trump, with the rise of all these progressive movements, right? Just particularly when he takes office, right? And movements that emerge. There's the anti-Muslim ban. There's the Black Lives Matters and the police question. I mean, just think about even the thing from Gaza to Ferguson, which was a little earlier. But what about from Ferguson to Fallujah? There's an incredible silence in kind of progressive liberal circles about the fact that the U.S. is at war, and it is still at war. It's a very domestic, even if the external world seeps in, why is there a Muslim ban? The focus remains very domestic. And I think some of that has to do with the crisis over, well, what are we, like, there were progressive circles that could imagine, right, you can think the Vietnam War is an anti-colonial war, right? And get a lot, but I really think that liberals and progressives have no idea what to do with Al-Qaeda, to understand its emergence. They have no way of understanding Iraq without writing it, if not into Al-Qaeda, into, these Muslims, right, they always had these problems. So I think it's been kind of paralyzing, and there's been no way to pick up a kind of political critique. So either it's they deserve it, or, it was a mistake, we shouldn't have done it, but there's still no politics to that, right? There's no real analysis, because I think that there's a kind of assumption about who you're fighting, that somewhere between they're all evil and they're all nuts. And what are we going to do? There's no allies that we can see ourselves aligning ourselves with. And I think that's different, at least in progressive circles around the war in Vietnam. There was a vision of an opposition one could align oneself with. It might have been a romantic vision, but it was a vision, right?
Right. I mean, even when at moments of withdrawal, when announcing withdrawal, it was like, well, we can't be responsible for the mess that's there anymore. Right. Afghans have to step up and take this responsibility without any acknowledgement of what is the actual responsibility of the American project in Afghanistan. Any more questions?
Hi, thank you both so much for this very insightful conversation. My question is, I guess, kind of tangentially related, but I'm just curious about how this whole discourse around trauma and the figure of the traumatized soldier relates to the increasing privatization of U.S. kind of imperial ambitions abroad, and if that therapeutic discourse has seeped into the private sector, or if it's kind of in retreat because it's now more of a black site than it was even in the military. So I don't know if
you mean sort of private contract, who's fighting?
Yeah, private contractors with the military.
Okay, so I don't know, Anjali, if you agree with this. Well, one of the things that is so striking to me is, so I use the term the trauma hero, which comes from Royce Scranton, who's a vet, actually a very radical vet of the Iraq War, wrote about. In all the talk of the civil-military divide and the kind of reverence or altruism or whatever of the soldier, or owed to the soldier or whatever, the contractor is nowhere to be seen. If you really threw the contractor in, then this figure that deserves reverence, if that's the right word, would become a lot more complicated, right? So, no, there's no programs for traumatized contractors I mean, keep in mind the contractors to soldiers are complicated. It tends to be soldiers leave the military, go into contracts and come back. But the conversation about the civil-military divide and the heroism of stepping up to serve when no one else will erases the entire reality of basic private contractors. We have to, mercenaries fighting the war, right? I mean, be very clear when what is that Russian group called? The Mozart group or something? Or it's the other one. Sorry? Wagner, right, the Ukrainians, right. An American vet went in and started the Mozart group and respond. The Wagner group is referred to in the New York Times as mercenaries. I have never seen the New York Times refer to Blackwater as mercenaries, right. So there's a very nice kind of erasure there, because then it's not altruism. Why are you fighting this war? It's not sacrifice, right?
And I mean, that's extended, I think, also to the sort of the contractors who are not fighting, but who are doing the actual work, cleaning and building, and, which leaves the just changed the whole experience of being a soldier, right?
Well, and the other thing that I haven't said explicitly, but is really important, is this figure of the trauma hero and this whole figure of the traumatized vet presumes it is the image of the grunt, right? It's the soldier on the front line that is fighting. The vast majority of soldiers never see combat. That is not, right? So you already have to sort of have this figure, and then everyone who has served, again, think about that term, in the military is attached to that figure. I was once at one of these civilian military dialogue, for lack of a better word, groups, and somebody, very lovely person, I don't mean this personally, and really critical of the American military and the war at this point. But for the first 45 minutes talking about his experiences and trauma and whatever, and in the Q&A, so this person inhabited this position of being the traumatized soldier. And then during the Q&A, someone asked how long they'd been in Iraq or Afghanistan, and he'd never been either. He'd been on a boat off the coast of Japan the entire time. And I'm sure being in the military, but it was interesting that he could play and that didn't shift the reverence in the room, right? I'm not doubting he probably was traumatized, and then he started talking about how traumatic training was and whatever. But it didn't shift that sense that he knew war in a way that the rest of us did not. I was like, really? I mean, that it didn't shift the tenor of the conversation at all when he said that. It was very striking.
Yeah, and when you have all these civilian third country nationals, as they're called, sort of brought in from, Nepal and Uganda and India to cook and clean, I mean, many of them are also affected if there's a mortar shell. Many of them probably also experience the trauma of, you've had some of those contractors getting kidnapped and killed. And there's no mention of them anywhere here. And they form a very large portion of, for years of what was left behind in Afghanistan. So, more questions?
I just wondered about drone operators and that distance, if there are examples of people experiencing PTSD through I guess some of them are in Maryland and Bagram Air Base and
Yeah, well, that, it's very controversial because, for one thing, if you, it's controversial within the military, too, because, well, you weren't really at risk. But I think the thing about the drone operator that's interesting is it forces the question of perpetration onto the paper. Clearly, their lives are not at risk. They're not fearful, right? It's like this pure moment of what is it? If you're traumatized, if one wants to accept that, what are you traumatized by? Well, you're traumatized by having killed someone, right? And there's a kind of intimacy to the kill. As people say, it's the sniper and the drone operator that sees the kill in a different way, right? So there's, everything about distance versus closeness, but also what is a source of trauma. It's certainly not victimhood in any way, if you're the drone operator, right? Brings that into sharp relief, but it's very controversial.
have a question. Even during the Vietnam years, to what extent did conversations about soldiers, the trauma that soldiers experienced, make it harder to talk about the violence they'd perpetrated as a war crime?
I feel like I should ask the person in the back of the room, but I mean, I think that they were not. Okay. I think so my reading of sort of that history and some of the stuff that was in the paper was they weren't separate, because the point was, if you believe that what the US military doing in Vietnam was, Robert J. Lifton called it was an atrocity producing situation, right? So that if the nature of the war itself was just one atrocity after the other, right? There were free fire zones, right? Et cetera, et cetera. The body count was right? So how many people were killed was the measure of progress, et cetera. Then the issue wasn't that they weren't war crimes. The issue would then be, but who is legally accountable, right? If war crimes are the exception, then you're individually responsible. So I think that could go together, because the argument was, this is what we're doing, right? But it's the structure of the war itself, right? Not just that deciding to go to war was right, but that it was structurally, the kind of rules of engagement were such that war crimes were just like
As
kind of
opposed to
everything.
Abu Ghraib being the result of a few bad apples.
Right.
Well, first of all, most Americans don't know shit about what happened in Vietnam.
Yeah.
To this day, period, end of story. We have these idiotic discussions continually as Americans. We were fighting a foe who was using people's war strategy and had fought against the French and defeated them with their version, Vietnamese version of that. And what that meant was a mobilization of everybody in the areas, the liberated zones. So when we land in '65 with conventional forces, when the Marines landed in Da Nang, and then we send in conventional forces afterwards, we're coming into areas which essentially have been governed by the NLF for 15, 20 years. And down to the village level, they would have, for example, the term in Vietnamese was Thu Ve Nan Dan, which meant village self-defense militia, which meant everybody is mobilized to help support the regional and main force units of the NLF, which meant that people would be mobilized to carry supplies. If a regiment or battalion of the NLF, BC, if you will, is moving from point A to point B, people from that area, because they are mobilized to support them, are going to help them. Hence, when we encounter them in combat, in local situations, in villages, et cetera, we're fighting against people who are fully mobilized to fight us, including down to kids, all right, everybody. And so when you then encounter that kind of foe, and you're taking casualties, and you're armed the way we were, you're just going to lay artillery and air power on them to destroy them, period. And that is the root of how everything evolves from there. And then, of course, you're in a situation where you don't know who is what. You don't know who is the enemy, who's not the enemy. And then you're going to have people who are, again, mobilized against you. That was something for Americans was very hard to handle. The same way those who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan go through a similar kind of situation, because they're fighting a different kind of guerrilla war. But it's always one where ultimately civilians do indeed become the victims of that conflict. Right. And you're right 100% about that.
Right.
That is something factored out of our consciousness completely, because they become the evil other, and we don't want to think about them.
Right. And I just want to say, but the difference, which is crucial, is in these critical conversations about the war in Vietnam that were had as part, and again, I'm going off of interviews and papers and people, right, were had as part of trying to understand what came to be known as post-Vietnam syndrome initially. There's a critical engagement with that language, right? Like that, yes, and very particularly also a critical engagement with the racism that allows anybody to be shot, which doesn't mean that guerrilla warfare is not embedded in the community. Here, and kind of post the talk about counterinsurgency war. And by the way, so much of this medical literature writes as if this is the first counterinsurgency war. And the only reason I can think about that is because they don't want to be associated. They want to see this as very different from the war in Vietnam, because otherwise it makes very little sense. It's really an explicit argument about, it's not about this is a people, right, a guerrilla movement per se. It's actually an argument about culture. That they don't, right, it's barbaric. They use, right, I mean, I'm not saying that didn't exist then, but there's something, right, there's all this stuff in Afghanistan about how there are these horrific cultural practices. So you have this weird kind of culturalist, almost multicultural moment, but where it's culture as opposed to how guerrillas fight wars that becomes the explanation for the impossible position that American soldiers are put in, and the fact that even though it's a deeply, deeply held, I mean, the argument about this term moral injury, which is a way of re-articulating the trauma of perpetration, among other things, from the Vietnam era, the central thing is that the contradiction is between the moral codes that are instilled within soldiers so deeply by the US military and the realities they face on the ground where they can't live up to the moral demands of the military. That is not in any way the discourse amongst psychiatrists who treated Vietnam veterans. Even people who were not particularly anti-war, they didn't have this reverence for the American military, right?
I mean, I think there's also something about this is why American veterans, even those who are critical of the war, might identify with civilians in other countries rather than fighters, because there is no context in which combatants might be doing something that you can identify with, which is odd, because if your country is being bombed and you are trying to fight back, and I thought that was what was so interesting about this Iraqi journalist I interviewed, where he said, you know, if I had been living in Fallujah, he was brought up in France, he said, if I had been living in Fallujah, I might have joined the fight too, to defend my city.
Right, because the enemy are not combatants, they're terrorists.
Right. So I think that question of like, how do you separate becomes actually quite murky, no matter, but we only see it from the perspective of the American soldier who feels ambushed.
This has been a really, really wonderful and illuminating conversation. Thank you both so much. Let's give them a nice- Thank you.